Hello everybody, welcome to episode 6 of the Altengrad city. We have been building the bridge, the truss bridge, something that might have been built very recently in the time period that we are currently in. We have also built some open areas around the bridge, the plaza with the fountain, the parks and all that. And today we will continue with somewhat close area, which is going to be the castle, the hill around the castle as well. Well, it's not really a castle, but I'm going to talk a bit more about that in this episode. So let's get right into it. So this building, I'm going to call it, I probably should call it the palace, and I'm going to get into why that is in just a moment. So that's pretty much what this video is going to be about. So we need to do this hill. I'm going to detail it. I'm going to put some garden right on the side of this hill and also a vineyard. That's something that I'm already kind of planning in here. But I would really like to talk a bit about different kinds of things. So you can see in the time lapses what I'm doing in City Skylines, but I'm going to talk a bit more about history in this episode, about the words that we actually use today for palaces, castles, and all these kinds of buildings, how they developed in time and what they actually mean today, because I find it kind of interesting, so I wanted to share it with you. All right, so here we go. If we want to know the origins of especially Western European words, we usually need to go to Latin. In Latin, there was a word castellum, which meant a military fortified structure, pretty much even today's definition of a medieval castle. So that's the English word for castle. French word chateau also comes from the same Latin word, but French is a bit more complicated. More on that later. In the Germanic provinces of the Roman Empire, they used the Latin word burgus for, again, some military fortified structures. Burg, again, translates as castle into English. Now, let's move further east. Here we had the Proto-Slavic language, which was a common ancestor of today's Slavic languages. Here we already find the word grad. This word had a lot of meanings over time. It could have been used as a core of some longer words, meaning fortified towns, smaller or larger, or just towns or castles. In today's Czech and Slovak, hrad only means castle. But in some more Eastern languages, it is also used as town or simply town. But even languages that don't actively use this word might still have it as part of some names. Good example of this is the Hungarian town of Visegrad. So we have the fortified medieval castle and words describing it in multiple languages. So far so good. Let's fast forward to times when the old principle of a fortified castle started to lose its sense. With the advances in technology, gunpowder, guns, and also the fact that wars were starting to be less common and the need of a castle in its old form was not needed as much. It's worth noting, especially for someone who is not living inside Europe, that castles were absolutely everywhere at this point. Not just kings had their castles, but also a lot of lesser nobility, families, and such had their own castles. Not to mention that they might have had more than just one if they were rich enough. Just to put this into perspective, the Czech Republic today has 6,258 cities, towns, and villages, and apparently there are over 1,400 known castles and castle-like structures. Now this is where it gets complicated. Hopefully I say it so it makes sense. Let's start with Czech language. Here we have the word hrad, and today it's used to describe a medieval fortified castle. But like I said, as these castles started to get obsolete, another type of structure started to be more common. This structure in Czech is called zámek. It literally means lock, as in the object you put keys in. Zámek is usually a nice-looking building built for noblemen as either their homes, summer homes, country houses for hunting, but even seats of power and so on. Fortifications could have been still present, but were usually not. All of these structures are covered under the single word zámek. Now, English language doesn't have a word to directly translate this. Google Translate just gives you the word castle. And this is where it gets even more confusing, if you go to the Czech page for zámek on the Wikipedia and just switch it for English, it gives you the word chateau. But that's not really English word, is it? To make things even more confusing, Polish also uses the word zámek, but in their language it means hrad in Czech. So it's more similar to the English castle meaning. Now, most similar to Czech in this regard is German, where they have their Burg and also Schloss, which also means lock, and describes similar looking structures, although apparently it differs between German regions. But interesting here is that the word Schloss also has its own page on the English wiki. So apparently the English wiki has the word chateau and schloss separated. So according to the English Wikipedia writers, it's not the same thing. Anyway, on the schloss page, they describe it as something like a chateau, palace, or a manor house. And apparently in the UK, it would probably be called stately home or country house. Now, if you would take this definition and apply it for the Czech zámek, it's not exactly accurate. Now let's talk about the English word chateau, English one. It clearly comes from French, but what is interesting here is that it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as the French chateau. If you want to talk about the medieval fortified castle in French, you could say chateau fort, probably with better pronunciation, sorry. The English page for chateau says that in English it's more specific, but in French it can sometimes mean even the old fortified castle. So what's the difference in French between chateau fort and just chateau? Well, the French page says that the words were pretty much the same, but chateau started to be more common than chateau fort because the fort implied purely military purpose, which was not always the case. And this is really cool. There's a sentence on the French wiki saying that the word chateau fort is somewhat abandoned in favor of just chateau. If you put this sentence into Google Translate from French to English, for example, it literally says, word castle was somewhat abandoned in favor of the word castle. Okay, I see. And if you translate it in Czech, then it says the word zámek was somewhat abandoned in favor of the word zámek. Well, that's absolutely clear, isn't it? Now, is this complicated or not? Let's make it more so, because we still haven't talked about palaces. The word palace again comes from Latin. It's pretty much the same word in most of the European languages. Now let's start with English. So the wiki says it's a grand residence, especially a royal residence or the home of a head of state or some other high-ranking dignitaries. But it also might be used in English to describe basically any kind of grand-looking building when no better word in English is available. And when I say no better, I mean you just can't call it a castle. Good example of this is the Palace of Versailles, which is not a palace in French, but a chateau. Somewhere I read that the difference between palace and chateau in French, no matter their purposes, is that chateau is built in the countryside and palace in the city. Now, Chateau de Versailles is in a city today, but wasn't when it was built. So that's why it's called chateau and not palace in French. Also, in some old French sources, the word palace was connected to the government, as in palaces were government buildings, seats of power, and so on. So it makes sense that those buildings would be only inside cities, and therefore calling any grand-looking building, residential building, a palace in English is wrong in this regard. Another example of this is the German Schwerin Palace. Also not palace in German, but Schloss, obviously. Now, in Czech, for example, the word palace was defined as a residence of nobility. And it could have been used also to describe the residential part of a medieval castle. So the entire complex was a castle, but some few buildings inside the castle was a palace. Now, fast forward to 19th century and early 20th, palaces are now basically every grand-looking urban buildings. Judicial palaces, commercial palaces, palaces of culture, and so on. Also, how these buildings evolved in time, quite a lot. I read a comment on some previous Altengrad episode, I think the first one, that old castles were not really rebuilt over time in Europe. Sure they were, and in great numbers too. Out of those some 1,400 castles and castle-like structures in the Czech Republic, more than 400 of those structures changed from military forts and castles into chateaus and palaces. And again, you would call them zámek in Czech. Sometimes they kept their fortifications, sometimes they didn't, sometimes the old castle was completely destroyed, sometimes the towers were kept and, things like that. The bottom line here is that a single structure in a certain country could be called differently in different languages. This is made worse by the fact that some languages just use the same words as other languages but with different meanings. So it's always best to just stick to the original word used to describe the building by either their builders or the users. Now finally back to Altengrad. What is the building on top of this hill then? It could be a castle, it could even be a chateau, in the Czech meaning of the word. It certainly could be a palace. I'm thinking that this is a palace, okay? as it was built as the city residence for some nobles, maybe even rulers of this land. In these times, it got converted into the presidential palace, where the president resides when working, accepting visits, and so on. It only has a small garden on the side of the hill, which might indicate that it used to be a castle that got seriously reworked, and there simply wasn't room for some French-style gardens anymore, as the city around it was already standing. Most of these urban palaces were only the city residences anyway, and their users could have owned some countryside chateau with much larger gardens as well as this one. Alright, so that was all for my carefully planned commentary for this episode. Let's finally go into City Skylines, into the game, and let's talk about what's happening in here. What am I building? What am I actually doing with this piece of land in Altengrad? So we had the building for the palace from the first episode, and I really wanted to put something on the hill. I was inspired by a city called Mělník in Czech Republic, which also has a again, how should I call it? Palace, castle, some kind of a nice looking building on top of a hill, right along the river, and it's kind of tall. And on the side of the hill, it also has this nice looking vineyard. There's many different examples of these kinds of places in the country as well, when you have some kind of a fairly steep hill and you have some vineyards in there. Is it actually pronounced vineyard or vineyard? I'm not actually sure. Sorry. So we have some portion of this hill obviously reserved for the garden of the palace. That's exactly what I'm building in here. I was not really sure how the inside of the garden is really going to look like. I was not sure how to put these paths through it. It's kind of difficult in City Skylines to do different elevations, especially with some paths and things like that. Now later, as we progress in time, I'm probably going to open these gardens to the public. So I'm probably going to put some park people's generators in here and just make this place more open, as the palace itself is probably not going to be used by the presidents too much. Maybe it could be used later as some sort of just a visitation place for all kinds of foreign visitors and all those kinds of people, just like, for example, the Prague Castle is today, right? So right now we don't have that though. We have the gardens completely closed off, and we're just gonna have them decorated. Now I also prepared a special kind of cinematic shot for the garden. I'm basically going to do like a very low shot, basically from the point of view of a visitor, of a person. I'm not sure how it's going to look like when it's going to be made 4 times faster than I recorded it, but hopefully it's going to be all right. I had to record it manually because you can't really do these low shots with the cinematic camera. So hopefully it's going to be looking all right, and if it's going to be looking all right, I probably would like to do it in some future episodes as well. But back to what's happening in here. Well, not much really. I'm just decorating this place, detailing it with all kinds of flowers, bushes, and trees. I was not exactly sure if I can use every single tree that I have at my disposal, because I obviously downloaded all these trees that I have right now for the Aurelia series, and in Aurelia I don't really care if the trees and flowers and all those decorations are from one part of the world, right? Now in the 1920s, let's say, that we are in right now, I guess that it would be possible already that some different trees were just transported, maybe as some gifts even, to the royal families from different parts of the world. Obviously not like super exotic plants, because they wouldn't be able to thrive in here, but some more exotic looking trees from I don't know, the same weather environments all around the world probably could have been able to survive in here anyway. But I mostly used the trees and bushes and flowers that I thought that I could probably pass as some Central European flora. Anyway, just putting some decorations in here, as well as this statue in here. Some benches in here I will later put there. I'm not exactly if I'm showing all these detailing works that I'm doing here. So this episode was somewhat different, because we didn't really place much buildings, right? We placed just a couple of buildings, pretty much only for decorations. I don't think I put any of this building as a real building, but more as procedural objects, only because they are kind of farther away from the road, or I don't want them to do something with the terrain, because they are mostly built around the hillside, and obviously if you put the real building there, then the terrain is going to go flat kind of in a larger area around the building, which would make it a lot difficult for me to do some kind of detailing in here. Now, we also had this place open still from like episode 3 or something, where we needed to treat this road that goes into the moat or whatever it's called, you know, underneath the bridge that goes to the palace. So I just put a ruin of an old watchtower. Maybe the old castle walls were going through this place. Maybe there was some kind of a gate in here for the really old castle, you know, something like that. I just like ruins, so I just put it there. And that's pretty much all. I'm not really sure what else I'm supposed to talk about, because this is just ordinary looking detailing that we have already seen in some previous episodes, because I am kind of finishing areas that were already started back in episode 1 as well, with especially with the palace. So that's all for episode 6, guys. Thank you for watching it. I hope you liked it. If you did, then you can always put a thumbs up underneath the video, and you can share the video with your friends and subscribe to the channel if you're new here. In the next episode of Altengrad, we are going to go back into the city, and we are going to expand it some bit more, but I'm going to kind of keep it a secret and not really reveal it too much. Anyway, guys, thank you again for watching this episode. I will see you next time. Take care and goodbye.